searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome everybody back to another episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming. I am your host, Sean Evans, otherwise known as Zion Tane.
And I am your other host, Sid Bolton. I'm your gaming archaeologist. You can find me on PSN and Xbox Live as Dirk the Daring.
And this week, Sid, we're going to be talking with Mark Vittek, who created a game way back in about 1981 or 1982 called U-Boat for the VIC-20.
For the Commodore VIC-20, yes. Very early computer.
Back in the day when computer programs were distributed in text form in a magazine. And the only way you could play this game was to purchase the magazine and type it in yourself.
Yes, and this game is very difficult to find today. It's not something you're going to be able to, download off just anywhere. So in order to play this game, you're actually going to have to, either look at, say, a YouTube video or download the ROM, or we even have a special surprise this week for how you can actually see what U-Boat looked like.
Absolutely. So we have entered into a little bit of a collaboration with Gaming History 101, which you can find over at gaminghistory101.com. And the curator over there, Fred, he is going to stream U-Boat this Friday night, this coming Friday, which will, I believe, be, I don't even know the date offhand, the 31st of July. At 11:30 Eastern Time, which is 10:30 Central Time, he's going to stream U-Boat for about 30 minutes. And like all of our shows here at OMG Nexus, it will be a very clean stream. You don't have to worry about language. But he does warn us that closely followed by that will be his regular stream. So, which may not be quite as clean. So,
but so yes, you've been warned.
You've been warned. So check out Gaming History 101. And he basically, whenever he can, whichever games we cover, he's going to stream it for us on the following Friday. I think it's going to be awesome.
That's going to be great. Because a game like U-Boat, you're not going to find too much of it out there because it truly is a lost treasure of game.
It really is. So why don't we go talk to Mark about how this game came to be and all about U-Boat?
Sounds good.
So we have with us Mark Vittek with us tonight. Thanks again for coming on Lost Treasures of Gaming, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
So tonight, we want to talk a little bit about mostly U-Boat, which is a fairly old game. And I think Sid actually has a reason why he personally used this game as a lost treasure. This game has a lot of personal meaning for Sid, doesn't it?
It does. It's and this is actually the reason why I sought poor Mark out to ask him some questions about this game. So, from my perspective, the thing is that when I first had a computer, my first computer that I owned was a VIC-20, and I know for a lot of people that could have been their first computer as well. It certainly wasn't as popular as the Commodore 64, but it was the world's first color computer that was under $300. So to say that it sort of brought color computing to the masses is completely accurate. And one of the interesting things about U-Boat was it was a game that was not distributed perhaps in what we would consider a normal fashion today. It was actually distributed inside of a computer magazine called Compute. And you might think, okay, so software inside of a magazine, I've heard of that before, but no, not the way you might be thinking. It wasn't on a cartridge, it wasn't on a diskette, it wasn't on tape, it was actually inside the pages of the magazine, and you had to type it in yourself.
Yes.
So that was kind of an innovative way of doing software distribution in the 80s. And the reason why this game has a personal interest to me is because my father used to be a U.S. Marine, living in Canada, actually. He went over the border when he was just a young lad and joined the Marines. And so he had this thing with boats. He always seemed to enjoy boats and things like that. And it was really the only video game I could actually get him to play, which was interesting in itself. He was kind of scared of the computer, and I remember when I had actually typed in the program and I got it working and I was playing it, my dad came downstairs to look at what I was doing, saw me playing this game, basically grabbed the joystick and started playing. So, and the thing is, I actually have a photo of him with a cigarette in his mouth, which was the typical thing that he would do. He'd have a cigarette in his mouth, joystick in his hand, and he loved U-Boat. And so for that reason and that reason alone, this program is very important to me personally.
So, Mark, this game was distributed. How long ago was it now? 30 years or more?
I think it came out, was probably first published in, 1981?
In 81.
81, 82, yeah.
Yeah.
I think actually it was November 82 was the issue of Compute. So you probably wrote it, correct me if I'm wrong, but you probably wrote it several months before the magazine actually came out. So probably 81 for you maybe, and then not published until 82.
Right. That I think was my actually my second program that they actually published.
I was going to ask you if that was among your first games that you've written. So what was the inspiration behind writing U-Boat, and how did you go about even getting your programs into magazines?
Well, I guess because I didn't know any better, I just decided, well, I'm just going to send them my program and see if they'll publish it. And especially as you know, back at that time, there was not a lot of software out there. In fact, it was like really hard to find a store that actually even sold stuff.
Yes.
So actually finding a magazine and typing it in was way easier than actually finding a store at that time.
I remember, I've always told the story that for the longest time, this was back when I was in grade 7, grade 8, and the only way I got software was by trading with friends. And I remember walking into a computer store many years later and not even realize, like, all of a sudden they're selling games. Like, what? You mean you can buy games? What? I actually, honestly, I am not even kidding. I had no idea that I could have gone to a store to buy games for my Commodore 64, because I grew up trading games with friends, just copying discs. That's all I knew. But yeah, I do remember, buying magazines and typing in the programs. I even wrote my own programs on VIC-20 and C64 myself. But what was the inspiration behind U-Boat?
Well, actually, back at that time, even in arcades, there was very few video games. And practically years earlier, before Pac-Man, Galaga, and all those, even before Pong, it was just really hard to find, anything that looked like a computer game. And I think one of the earliest ones that I played that I would call a computer game was called Seawolf.
Oh, yes. And
so if you kind of see the parallel of, you were a sub and you were sinking ships, as they went by, I think I just kind of took it that way. But instead of it, from the first-person perspective, I did it from the third-person perspective.
And one thing that I want to talk about, I don't want to get too technical, and Mark, you probably may not even remember a lot of the technical details about this game since it was, 33 years ago. I mean, how many of us can remember exactly what we did 33 years ago? But, going back and looking at the article in the magazine, and it is linked into the show notes for our sister podcast, the OMG Hour. But in there, you talk about how, and this program, just so people know, and we can discuss this in more detail as we go here, was actually written in BASIC for the most part. I'm not even sure if you did any assembly language, but that was actually not, that common to write games in BASIC, because unless they were very slow-moving games, but this was an action game written in BASIC, and you would never really know it because most of the time the faster arcade-style games always had to be written in assembly language. But it's quite interesting because in the article you actually discuss how you were able to optimize the code and make it, and you used some string functions. You used mid string and left string and right string in a way that most programmers would use simply for text processing, so taking input from a user and maybe taking parts of it and analyzing it and things like that. But you actually use that to move the ships around, which I think was a very interesting, effective use, because you found that was actually faster than doing peeks and pokes, which are ways of looking inside and changing the computer's memory. And I thought that was a very unique aspect of what you did. And I remember actually reading the article and trying to understand, because, I wrote software professionally for most of my professional career. So I started out programming on the Commodore PET and the VIC-20, and I learned a lot about what programming was and how it worked from articles that I typed into Compute. And I often changed the games. I never changed U-Boat, I don't think, but a lot of times I would, type in the program, get it working the way it was supposed to, and then go in and make my own custom changes. So I just wanted to point out that you did some kind of what I thought was unique stuff with mid-string and things like that were not really, I don't think, the way that they were intended to be used. So that was kind of cool to look back at that and see how you did that.
Thanks, because at that time it was I wanted to use poke and peek for everything, but I found it to be exceedingly slow once you put a number of things on the screen. And actually, the whole design around U-Boat, since the ships were always in the same place, they didn't have to, change their elevation. It was way easier and way faster to use. I think it was mid-string to actually get them to scroll across.
Yeah, that's a very very interesting even today, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, wow, if I was to sit down and write a game today, would I do that? And I actually did sit down with a VIC-20 in 2010, and I wrote a Twitter client, and I used a lot of mid-string and left string and right string to do some processing of all that stuff. So because of course I had to write my own routines to simple things that we don't think of today. For example, asking the user for their password. Well, of course, in modern operating systems, there's a way of just telling the operating system that it's a password, and so it'll put asterisks on the screen for you. Well, you know what? The VIC-20 didn't have that, so you had to write your own password routine. So that's a case where mid-string, left string, and right string are very, very useful, but I never would have thought about using them to implement a game. So very, very cool.
And especially, I don't know if you made the comment about it, but like even since we were using 3.5K at that time,
yes,
we had to write two programs, one to load in the graphics and one to actually play the game.
Right. Yeah, so you would have one sort of program that would basically change some of the internal memory to set up the graphics, and then that itself, once you were kind of done with that, it wasn't necessary anymore. Once the code to do all those changes could be then thrown away, and then you'd have your main program that controlled the logic and the actual gameplay would then be able to use up the extra memory. And in a VIC-20, if you're writing stuff in BASIC, you literally had 3,583 bytes to work with, which is 3.5K, which is absolutely nothing. In fact, any email that any person sends pretty much is going to use more than that today. So if you think about that, that's pretty amazing that you were able to make a fully functional game that was a lot of fun in 3.5K.
So I got to ask, Mark, when I was back in the 80s when I was working on VIC-20, I was learning everything myself. It was kind of word of mouth and just playing around with stuff. How did you learn to program on the VIC-20 and then eventually create this game?
Well, I think even what was said earlier, where you just got like a program out of a magazine, you typed it in, and then you started messing around with parameters in order to figure out what they did, and what you could get by with just changing the code.
And do you remember how old you would have been at that time, Mark?
Actually, I was still in high school because I graduated back in '82. So, probably I started about 2, maybe 3 years, just ahead of my graduation. I started messing around with computers, and the VIC-20 being the first one that I bought. And those programs that I wrote actually helped pay for them.
Oh, nice.
And after you wrote, U-Boat, and now step back 1 second. Do you remember what the first program was that you wrote? Was it a game, or was it a utility, or what was it?
It was actually a game. It was called Grand Prix Foo, and that was just, it was just one of those driving games where you had to drive between the lines, and I actually wound up using I think it was midstring for that one too, so that it would print, and it would, as it printed, it scrolled down, and you had just this little card that would peek and poke in order to move between the lines, and so if you ever hit the edge of the curve, you crashed. And I didn't even have a good random sequence back then, so I actually programmed the road in myself.
Wow. And do you think that the limitation, did you do that one on the VIC-20 as well, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Do you think that the limitations of the hardware of the day actually helped you innovate what the game would do and certainly how it would work? Did you ever, think that maybe there was probably things that you couldn't do, but do you think that hardware limitation actually ended up contributing to the gameplay in certain ways?
I think it did, because what it did was it made you think small, and I know of too many people, they would try to write a game, try to make it big, and they could never finish it because they kept, adding more and more and more, where with the VIC-20, you were very limited, and you could easily write a game in a day or two.
Right. And do you remember how long it took you to write U-Boat? Do you remember how long would it have taken you? Just a few days, or?
Probably just a few days, and some time to have some friends play it and try to QA it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask who helped you test it. Was it friends? Was it your family? Did your parents? Were they interested in this kind of stuff, or they just thought you're in your bedroom programming or something like that, or wherever you were? Did they just sort of leave you alone?
They left me alone, and they kind of they were not all that accepting of me playing with computers all day long. And it wasn't until I got a job in the industry, and years later, when I was able to tell them that I was actually making twice as much as what they made, then suddenly, it dawned on them that, video games could actually be a career.
Maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. Now, before we talk to you about what you've done since U-Boat, just sort of the last thing about U-Boat I wanted to ask you about was, now, you wrote the program and you saw it in the magazine, and I'm sure that must have made you feel absolutely amazing that you had this thing published in all these magazines. I don't know if you remember how you felt when you got that issue in your hands, but was that the end for you in terms of U-Boat? Did you ever come across the game later, other than this sort of random connection that I made with you recently? Was there any other things that happened to you in terms of U-Boat after that you had published it initially?
Well, when I sent them the program for the VIC-20, and I think later, as it was being published, they had actually come up with a Commodore 64 version of it. And
yes,
so,
it's in the magazine. Yeah, they did publish a Commodore 64 version. So they actually took your game and they converted it, kind of like what maybe a more traditional publisher would do today. If a smaller development house came with one product and said, "Here's our product," they actually paid somebody, I'm assuming, to convert it to the Commodore 64.
Right, and then strangely enough, later and I was at a Target, and they had all this, that's when Target was actually starting to get into the software business and selling just very small programs, and one of them actually happened to be my program, but it was on the Commodore 64, so technically, that wasn't my property. But when I looked at it, and I even bought a copy and looked at it, I was like, no, those were the graphics I came up with. It was the gameplay that I came up with, but it was the Commodore 64 version of it. So
Yeah, because I think it's fair to say that although it's clear that you were inspired by Seawolf, it's definitely not a Seawolf clone per se. It does have a unique feel to it and everything. So now that must have made you feel pretty strange. Do you remember how long after it was that you saw that? Like, was it a couple of years, or was it just a year, or how long after was it that you saw it in the store?
Oh, it was a couple of years. I think I'd been in college for a little while. And then I came across that, and I was like, huh, that really looks like my game.
Yeah, I can't imagine how that must have made you feel. Probably a little bit of both. You're probably kind of proud, but then at the same time thinking, wait a minute, I'm not getting anything for this. How did they do this? What is this? What's going on here? So I bet you it's mixed emotions for sure.
Right. I mean, it was okay, because I think I almost want to say between the two programs I sold to Compute, and like Grand Prix Foo actually went into one of their, they used to have these little books, and I got royalties off that. I think that also helped pay for my Commodore 64, so.
Right, because they would publish sort of the book of games or whatever, and they would take listings from various magazines and put them together in a compilation. So you actually got paid for that one twice, so that's great. Because we have some of those books at the Computer Museum, so I'll have to look that up, and I'm sure we've got a copy of it. So it'd be interesting to see that in there. So after U-Boat, in terms of games, what happened to you? Did you keep writing games, or did you where did you end up after U-Boat?
Well, it was at that point where the games that they were starting to publish in Compute Magazine were machine language. And that, I was just going to college at the time, hadn't really picked up on that. But in order to really, I think, compete in that market, you really needed to get faster and faster, and peaks and pokes and mid-strings, just weren't going to hack it. And that's kind of when I said, well, let me start, getting more into computer programming, but I was actually learning to, COBOL and Fortran and Pascal, things like that. So it wasn't really I wasn't really studying at the gaming market. And so I did kind of leave gaming behind for a while.
And when you came back, I'm just looking at some of the stuff on Moby Games. You've actually worked on some pretty big games here. You've worked on the Ultima series, Crusader, No Remorse, as a couple of examples. Can you tell us a little bit about those games and how you got involved in them and what you contributed to them?
Sure. In fact, the funny part was I didn't realize that there was a place here in Austin, Texas that made software. And I was surprised to learn that the kind of one of the grandfathers of computer games, Richard Garriott, actually had a company in Austin. And I went and I said, well, maybe I can do this. And so I applied, and suddenly I got a job in the quality assurance division. And having done that for 2 years, and that was probably one of the best learning experiences, because you got to see not only how games are written, but also how games don't work.
And that's when you were working on games such as Wing Commander, according to Moby Games here.
Right. In fact, I worked on actually the Commodore 64 version of Ultima 6 was one of the first games that I got to work on.
Wow.
And even Commodore 64's version of Bad Blood.
And so, what takes up your time now? Where are you now? And are you still working on games? Are you still in the gaming industry?
Actually, I am. I've been lucky enough to make a career out of it. Where starting out and starting on the Commodore, I've been able to shift over from did PC games, and then we moved from 2D to 3D, which was actually a huge shift in computers. And I've worked on console games, and I've most recently made the shift over to massively multiplayer online games.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm currently at a company called King's Isle, and I work on, it's a kids game called Wizard 101.
I think I've heard of that one.
If you watch any like Nickelodeon or something, you'll see commercials for it all the time. So,
yeah. And that's what you're currently working on at King's
yes.
Isle? Excellent.
Yes, I've been doing that for the past 7 years.
We're both going to ask.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sid.
So many questions. I was just going to say you've really, sort of covered the gamut of you've worked on obviously computer games to begin with on different platforms and then console games. What was kind of of all the different things you've worked on, what would you say is your favorite? So, for example, there's lots that I recognize. For example, Black Site Area 51 you worked on, which was, is a PC game, but also for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. What was, out of all this time that you've worked on different things, what would you say is your favorite? And you don't have to say what you're working on now, but of course, you've been working on that for quite a while. But is there anything from your past that sort of stands out as your absolutely favorite thing that you worked on?
Well, I'd probably have to say Crusader, the series, because I was the lead designer on that thing, and we used to just pour all of our time and all of our ideas directly into it, so much so that we gladly worked like 12 to 16 hours a day just putting a whole bunch of love into it.
So you mentioned, I just want to go back to Wizards 101 for a second, because you said, now according to this, it was released in 2008, and you've been working on it since. I got to ask, though, what's it like working on the same game for, 7 years now? Do you ever find yourself kind of wanting to do something new, or what's it like? Same game for 7 years.
It does present some challenges. Kind of before, like when working on like Crusader, the Ultima series, we were actually able to, it was still kind of the same characters, but the technology was always different. And so we always got to learn to do different traps, different puzzles, kind of things like that, which kept it interesting. Working on an online game where you just keep adding more and more content to it, it does, it is kind of nice having a very stable product that you can, that you don't have to worry about it blowing up in your face constantly like with new products. But it does, after a while, it does kind of run out of challenges, and it would be kind of nice to be able to dig my teeth into something new.
Yeah.
Have you ever worked on any mobile games or anything like that? Just even for fun? Like, am I ever going to see, an iOS version of U-Boat, for example? Is there anything like that in the future, maybe out of you, Mark?
Well, that I think is actually the beauty of what's going on. Years ago, I looked at how everything was like AAA games, and there was like no way to publish anything. Because, like a small game developer, you needed a lot of money to get into the market in order to advertise and get out there. Now we have these engines like Unity and Unreal, where you can actually come up with a small game, get it up on their website, get it out to the public for just, fractions of what it would cost. And I kind of look at this as almost like a new kind of era of like the Compute magazine time, where you would write something, send it in, get it published, and you didn't need wads of cash. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to, I've actually been playing around with Unity, and I actually wouldn't mind making smaller games again.
Well, you could do something like Mark Vittek's Best of Compute magazine. You could have your Grand Prix game. You could have U-Boat. Have a little collection going on. I will help you test it. Sean and I will help you market it. There you go. I just signed you up, Sean.
Awesome.
No, you make a good point. It's almost like in some ways, the game development cycle has sort of gone, full circle back to where it was a different time. And although the machines and the hardware aren't limited the same way they were back in the day. I think in terms of being able to have a relatively small idea, get it implemented and get it published without too much hassle is actually available again, which is one of the great things about, you know, the way things have gone in terms of that. So that's good, because I think otherwise there's probably a lot of good game ideas. Like, you might have even had some great game ideas floating around in your head, but just sort of dismissed them because you knew there would be no way to ever make them.
Yeah, I mean, and even with things like Unreal Engine being free to use now, anybody can download it and jump in and just play around, and who knows, you could come up with a game. Right now,
you're almost back to being able to develop a game on a one-person team again.
You know, yep. I think that's awesome that game development has come back around to that, you know, truly indie development, which is where this all started.
I almost kind of at this point wish I was a kid again, because I'm like,
oh yeah,
like Unity and Unreal, there's just so much firepower that you can use, but we're also seeing VR, you know, on the horizon, and it's like, oh my goodness, if I could be a one-man indie company, you know, in this big pond, it's like I could really do a lot better than anything that I ever hoped to dream, you know, with the VIC-20's 3.5K.
That's for sure. Now, I just want to wrap things up, but do you think back to things like U-Boat and like your Grand Prix game and think, you know, this is really where your career started? Do you kind of think, yes, I'm glad I did that, because that's what really got me going and got me to where I am today?
It actually took me years to recognize that, because most of the time whenever I filled out a resume, well, I always said that back when I joined Origin back in 91, that was, you know, when I got into the industry. But then I started thinking years later about it, and I'm like, wait a minute, I've been doing this a heck of a lot longer than I actually realize.
Yeah, it's almost 10 years difference.
Yeah.
From when you first started.
Yeah, you need to take that into consideration, right?
I actually do now, and even though it's kind of something that I'm not going to really put on a resume and go, hey, look what I did, and you know, on the VIC-20, because most people don't know what I'm talking about.
That's true.
Well, they may not know what you're talking about, Mark, but I can tell you that, you know, for me, that game has a great, you know, personal impact on me, and something. My father passed away in 1993, and it's something that when I think back to the times that him and I spent together on the computer, that is like the number one thing for me. So it may not be something that you're going to put on a resume, but it is something that I will never forget, and I just want to thank you so much for making that game and, you know, allowing me to find a connection with my father. And I think that that's kind of something that you would probably have never expected when you wrote it, and certainly probably never expected to hear about it 33 years later. But I can assure you that it means a lot to me, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That is actually probably the best feedback I've ever got on any product I've ever worked on. That is I mean, that really does tug at the heartstrings, and I'm glad you were able to share that with me, because that actually does kind of eclipse most of my other work, and it does make me kind of realize that I actually did make an impact with those early games. I thought maybe only the later games are what I am currently doing, but no, it is kind of hard to realize that people were playing those games back then and actually did enjoy. You know, by today's standards, they're so small, but I guess a game's a game.
Yeah,
that's true, and it's not like you had. You know, we didn't have social media back then or other ways, even really email, to let people know or give you that feedback, right? So, you're getting that feedback now, but it would have been very difficult to, other than maybe receiving letters, which even that would be a more difficult thing to do back in the day, and you wouldn't receive them for 3 to 6 months probably after people wrote them. But, it's a different world for sure. But, people do remember those things, and that's one of the things I love about the Computer Museum is that we get people coming in and sharing their stories with us and with me, and so it's kind of nice for me to be able to share my story with you because I don't get to do that too often. I get to receive a lot of other people's stories, but I don't often get to let people know my experiences. So again, thank you very much for that. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Mark, thanks so much for being on Lost Treasures of Gaming. How can people follow you? Are you on Twitter? Or can you find you there?
Probably. I do have a Twitter account. I just never get on it.
Okay.
Facebook is probably the easiest.
Maybe people can, we'll put your Twitter into the show notes, and then people can send you a message or tag you in a message if they remember any of your earlier games, or of course, I'm sure many of our listeners will remember anywhere from Ultima 6, 7, and 8, the Crusader series, Brute Force, Blackside Area 51, and of course Wizard 101. I'm sure if any of you remember any of those games, make sure that you send a message to Mark and let him know your personal memories of those games.
Awesome. Thanks again, Mark, for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.